I saw a movie last night that really got me thinking. The movie, which was so well done, was called Inside Job. This was a mainstream movie made by Sony Pictures Classics. Now, as we discussed earlier, we know who owns the media, and therefore Inside Job only covered the inside players, but did not touch at all on the subject of government ownership and wealth in these banks. So here again is the New York State Common Retirement Fund asset listing, only this time it's as of March 31st, 2006, just 2 years before the so-called financial collapse of 2008. And listed under Domestic and International Stocks, pages 1 through 66 on the report, we're going to go and look for all of the major players in that economic crisis. Now, prior to the economic crash, all of these banks, investment companies, and companies like GM and AIG were sitting pretty in the market, committing massive fraud right under everyone's nose. Now, it's important to understand that all of these companies were already owned by majority stock ownership by government. And once again, to prove this is true, all one needs to do is pull up the asset listings for pension funds and all of the other state, county, and municipal fund asset holdings, the investments of government. Moving down the list, we come to our first government-owned corporation, named Bear Stearns. Here we see 530 shares at a market value of $73,536,000. Also on this page is Berkshire Hathaway. Now, many people think of Warren Buffett as just some wealthy individual who somehow started this massive corporation. But let's not be naive. There are no massive individual corporations that aren't heavily invested in by government. Berkshire Hathaway is no exception. Simply stated, Warren Buffett is the figurehead, the CEO of that corporation, but only because government says so, through its proxy corporate governance votes, and by electing the board of directors. The goings-on at Berkshire Hathaway are mandated and voted upon by government, the main shareholder. Moving on, we see Countrywide Financial Corporation, another failed and merged corporation, at 3.7 million shares, a market value of $138.5 million. Looky there, there's Freddie Mac, at 2.9 million shares at a market value of $178 million. And of course, down the list is Freddie's sister, Fannie Mae, at 4.3 million shares and a market value of $224 million. Another key player in this absolute criminal activity was the government-held investment corporation named Lehman Brothers. Here's a little over 1 million shares at a market value of $153.5 million. There's Merrill Lynch and Company, which was assumed by Bank of America at 4.3 million shares and a market value of $340 million. Now remember, these are the values as of 2006. These companies do not exist anymore. Another root of all evil is Goldman Sachs Group Incorporated at 1.7 million shares and a market value of $268.7 million. There's Bank of America with 19.6 million shares and a market value of almost $900 million. Now, it's also very important to understand that the companies responsible for giving AAA ratings to these too-big-to-fail corporations and banks are also owned by government investment. Here's Barclays plc, the rating company, with 2.5 million shares at a market value of $29.8 million. Also, here's Moody's Corporation, another rating agency, with 1 million shares at a value of $71.5 million. And here's that darned insurance company that would have ruined the whole world economy if it failed, thus the too-big-to-fail motto. Here's American International Group, or AIG, at 10,998,000 shares at a market value of $726.8 million. And naturally, there's Morgan Stanley, another key player in this complete theft of American assets, a little over 5 million shares and a market value of $316.5 million. And not surprisingly, here's Citigroup Incorporated at 21.9 million shares with a market value of over $1 billion. And we can't forget Wells Fargo and Company at 7.5 million shares and a market value of $483 million. And then there's J.P. Morgan Chase and Company, with branches popping up all over the place after many, many mergers and acquisitions, with 17.9 million shares and a market value of $748,657,000. And of course, to complete the circle, the government naturally must own Dow Jones and Company Incorporated, with just this single New York pension system holding 201,000 shares at a market value of about $7.9 million. And then there's Dun & Bradstreet Corporation, the company that most people go to find out just how good a corporation is. 526,000 shares at a market value of $40.3 million. And of course, we mustn't forget General Motors Corporation, for which government claimed the assets of the company for itself, for its corporation, and nationalized the liabilities and debt to you and me, the taxpayer. We have 3.2 million shares at a market value of $69.8 million. Now, of course, all of these corporations received bailouts in the form of taxpayer money. But of course, since government already owned the companies, really the taxpayers were just giving gifts to government. Here's another bailout receiver, PNC Financial Services Group, at 1.1 million shares at a market value of $80.3 million. And another bailout company, U.S. Bancorp, at 7.6 million shares at a market value of $233 million. SunTrust Bank's another bailout receiver at 1.3 million shares at a market value of $100 million. Capital One Financial at 1.3 million shares and a market value of $112 million. The Bank of New York with 2.9 million shares and a market value of $104 million. And, of course, Mellon Financial, as in Carnegie Mellon, 1.5 million shares at $56 million. Yet another bailout receiver was Fifth Third Bancorp at 2.3 million shares and a market value of $91.8 million. And then there's Hartford Financial Services at 1.6 million shares at a market value of $129.8 million. Another big corporation involved in bailouts was American Express Company, the massive conglomerate credit card company, at 4.8 million shares and a market value of $250 million. Of course, the real list of bailed out companies is way too long to list here, but these 2 pages give you a good idea. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, this is a fluke. Of course, New York has investments in all these New York banks. It makes sense. Well, as with any scientific study, let's use a control and go across the country to California, to the California Public Employees Retirement System asset listings. And let's look for some of the same banks. Now, this report represents the stock values held by CalPERS for the year ending June 30th, 2006. Sure enough, there's American Express Company with 6 million shares, a market value of $322 million. And there's AIG with 12 million shares and a market value of $718 million. How about Bank of America Corporation? 21.9 million shares and a market value of $1,054 million. The Bank of New York Mellon at 4.7 million shares and a market value of $152 million. And there's our good old friend Bear Stearns at 637,000 shares and a market value of $89 million. And again, we see Berkshire Hathaway at a combined total of about $650 million. Capital One Financial at 1.7 million shares and a market value of $150.4 million. Citigroup Incorporated with over 25 million shares at a combined market value of about $1,244 million. Countrywide Financial at 2.8 million shares, market value of $108 million. Dow Jones and Company at about 419,000 shares at a combined market value of about $14 million. Dun & Bradstreet once again with a market value of $30 million. Fifth Third Bancorp with 2.7 million shares and a market value of $100 million. General Motors Corporation, 2.9 million shares and a market value of $88 million. There's Goldman Sachs at 2.3 million shares, a market value of $360.6 million. Hartford Financial at 1.4 million shares. JP Morgan Chase at a little over 20 million shares and a combined market value of about $835 million. Good old Lehman Brothers at 3.6 million shares and a market value of $236 million. Merrill Lynch, now part of Bank of America, at 4.9 million shares and a market value of $342 million. Mellon Financial at 2.4 million shares. Moody's Corporation at 1.5 million shares. Morgan Stanley at 5.7 million shares and a market value of $366 million. PNC Financial Services Group at 1.4 million. SunTrust Banks Incorporated at 1.9 million shares. U.S. Bancorp at 8.4 million shares and a market value of $262 million. Wells Fargo and Company, 7.5 million shares at $508 million. And finally, we have Barclays, which is actually an international corporation, at 19 million shares and a market value of $216 million. And of course, if you go through the report, you're going to see bank after bank after bank that is owned by government. Now, the lesson here is that the so-called financial collapse of 2008 and 2009 was not a random event. All of the companies involved, as you can see by just these two reports, out of over 200,000 different governments, each with their own investment funds. These banks were owned by government. Nothing that happens in the stock market is random. You must understand that this is a game, and you are being played like a fool. The government is stealing everything you own, and it is doing so lawfully. It is passing regulation, and it is deregulating the whole financial structure so that this type of theft can take place. This is why the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed. And as you can see, government investment funds and pension funds are acting as lending institutions, both nationally and internationally. There are no borders in this global marketplace that our corporation, our government, has created. Unless we stand up collectively right now, our land, our property, and our wealth will be gone.